Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Campfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, which is a community working to support and promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out other shows like Tech Won't Save Us, Anti-Girl Boss Socialist Club, and Alberta Advantage. You can look at the shows list at harbingermedianetwork.com. Before we get to the episode, I'd like to tell you that my book, Future on Fire, Capitalism and the Politics of Climate Change, is now available. It's a short book focused on the question of what it would take to achieve climate justice, with some thoughts about why even a ravaged planet is worth fighting for. If you're in Canada, you can order it directly from Fernwood Publishing. Everywhere else, you can order it directly from PM Press, and you can, of course, get it from many independent bookstores. The world is on track to a disastrous level of heating. By the year 2100, according to the organization Climate Action Tracker, we're looking at between 2.5 and 2.9 degrees heating above average pre-industrial temperatures. Then, of course, global heating is just one aspect of the global ecological crisis, which has many interconnected dimensions, including the extinction of many species, the erosion of soils, chemical pollution, the acidification of oceans, and more. More people are coming to understand that the underlying cause of this ecological crisis is capitalism, and that's one important reason why there's growing interest in different kinds of anti-capitalist politics. So I'm very glad to be joined on this episode of Victor's Children by two guests to discuss ecosocialism. We've got Sabrina Fernandes and Gareth Dale. So Sabrina Fernandes is a Brazilian sociologist and ecosocialist organizer, a contributing editor at Jacobin, formerly the editor-in-chief of Jacobin Brazil. She's the founder and producer of Tese Onze, which is a major eco-socialist education platform in Brazil, and also a member of the steering committee of the Global Eco-Socialist Network. She's the author of 2 books and a range of articles and chapters. One article I'll mention is she co-authored recently a piece called For an Eco-Socialist Degrowth, and I'll have that in the show notes for this episode. Gareth Dale from Britain is the author or editor of many books, including one on so-called green growth, and a range of articles in The Ecologist and other publications, including a whole number related to the topic that we're discussing today. One that stands out for me is an article on degrowth and the Green New Deal that Gareth wrote a number of years ago. I'll also include a link to that in the show notes, and Gareth's a member of the British group RS21. So thank you, Sabrina and Gareth, for joining me on this episode. And I'm just going to start off with the question about eco-socialism. So why would you say that we actually should be using that term to talk about socialist politics today? Why not just argue for socialism? What's the point about saying eco-socialism, or is there a point? Whichever one of you would like to start.
Yep. I can go ahead. Well, first, thank you for having us, David. It's a pleasure to be here at Victor's Children. I would say I get this question a lot because, in fact, eco-socialism is socialism. But there are 2 reasons why we would say eco-socialism instead. One is that not every socialism out there actually considers the ecological basis through historical materialism to understand political economy, levels of production, the impact that we have in society, and how we should actually aspire to have a socialism that is very different from capitalism, not only in the sense of who owns the means of production, but how we produce things, why we produce things, and what we're producing. So understanding socialism as a major civilizational change, also in matters of how we impact nature and how we're actually a part of nature as well. So it's important in terms of differentiating it. But also the eco right there is not just a prefix. So it's not just something that we're adding to it to say, well, our socialism here, it's green. It's really very much a part of how we understand society, how we understand our relationship as a human society to nature. It's informed even more so in the past 10 to 20 years by new understandings of Marxist basis, for example, around Capital Volume 3 and Karl Marx talking about the metabolic rift. So there's a very incredible body of work by a lot of authors who have done a really good job going back to it. We have the book by Kohei Saito called Karl Marx Ecosocialism, trying to look into those bases. So my claim for saying ecosocialism is that we're actually trying to show a different version of socialism here that's more deeply embedded with nature. And our argument would be that because it's more deeply embedded with nature, it's going to do a better job in terms of fixing what's wrong today, making a counterpoint to capitalism, and creating a society that's more radically different.
Gareth, would you like to add anything on this?
No, I'll pass on that one.
Okay. So there are many different kinds of politics that go under the banner of eco-socialism, just as, of course, there are many different kinds of socialist politics in general. For example, in the Canadian context, there are some people in the Green Party who call themselves eco-socialists, but what they mean when they talk about eco-socialism is really what I would simply call capitalism with ecological and social reforms, which are good reforms, mostly worth fighting for, but we need to be clear about their limits. So when you talk about eco-socialism or the society that we should be fighting for as our ultimate goal, what do you mean by that? What's the content of eco-socialism as an alternative to capitalism?
Well, I mean, I would look back to traditions of socialism that, first of all, analyze capitalism as a system that has to be overcome and overthrown. It's a system that is driving the world to disaster in terms both of poverty and economic polarization, and in terms of ecological destruction. I mean, you at the top of the program, at the top of the podcast, you were talking about the projections of, temperature rise of 2.1 to 3.9 above the pre-industrial average by the end of century. But there are projections out there that suggest it could be much worse than that, 4 degrees even higher than that. And there's a recent study by scientists at Caltech that predict that with 4 degrees heating, that could trigger a further 8 degrees due to a cascade of tipping points. So we're looking at a system, capitalism, that is driving the planet and everyone on it to disaster, and it has to be overcome. It has to be overthrown. It can't simply be reformed. And central to that overcoming, I think, is the process of class struggle, which is ultimately about care for one another as human beings, but which is predicated on care for the planet. So the socialism that I would look to is one that is centrally geared to social movements, to class struggle, understood as movements that build solidarity, develop ideas for alternatives. And in the course of building those relations of solidarity, we're extending the compass of our care, so to speak. It seems critical at the moment that social movements revive, and as they revive and interconnect, they develop anti-systemic potential and extend that compass of consideration and care to future generations, and to human beings all over the world, and to the planet itself. I mean, the conjuncture we're in at the moment is one in which there's such dreadful alienation from one another, which is bred in human beings across the planet, kind of terrible indifference to our collective fate, a sort of bleak loneliness, and in the absence of social movements that can point to a way forward. And that way forward, in terms of social system, I think would have to be one based on democratic planning. The so-called socialist societies, for me, had nothing whatsoever to do with socialism. They were state capitalist societies. The planning that was involved there in the Soviet Union and in China today had nothing to do with human need and the care for one another and for the planet. It was purely about capital accumulation. So that's the sort of socialist project that I would seek to further.
I really like the way Gareth talked about extending the compass of consideration and care. I think this is great goal for us to have, because it's not just about thinking of like this nucleus of a human society that we have today. It has to do with this intergenerational solidarity. And by being intergenerational solidarity, it's not, for example, sacrificing some today for the needs of those in the future, which there are people in the technological world who have that kind of perspective, like Silicon Valley moguls and people like that. But intergenerational solidarity is really about connecting these needs and building conditions today that will help to expand liberty today, that will ensure that people actually achieve what we would think of as a good life today, but ensuring that the material conditions for that good life remain for the future, or can be even improved upon in the future. So this idea about like the material conditions is really important here, because in eco-socialism, it's not just about these changes that we want to make in terms of the rearrangement around labor, but also understanding that there is a physical capacity on Earth that has to be taken into account whenever we're dealing with production, but also our own dreams. Right. So it's very easy to envision a society that looks like a science fiction kind of world. It's sometimes even of an like interesting exercise as well in terms of imagination, but we have to be aware of the physical limitations that we're dealing with. We have to be aware that technological improvement may help us here and there, but it's not going to change the laws of physics out of nowhere. It's not going to lead us into a situation where you can simply build whatever you want and not think about the consequences of it, especially if we're considering the differences in terms of the development of standards of living in the global south and the global north, and also the people who live in the margins in the global south, right? So people who live in sacrifice zones in both places, because those are present throughout the world. If we consider, for example, mining as a type of activity that generates sacrifice zones, we need to understand that, yes, we need to raise the standard of living of these people, but we can't do that promising everyone a bunch of flying cars, flying electric cars, and infinity pools, as I read in other places, right? So bringing these things into consideration is a huge part of eco-socialism, because it means that we also are positing other values, other ways of considering what a good life is. And sometimes that even means looking to cultures and teachings that have been ignored, suppressed, or suffered because of colonialism for a really long time.
All right. Well, thank you. I think to shift a little bit to the fact that this is an eco-socialist horizon that we've been talking about, but unfortunately a social revolution that could break with capitalism and actually open a transition towards it is unlikely for quite some time. It's not an immediate prospect anywhere at the moment. And so in the here and now, we're thinking about resistance and fighting for reforms in capitalist societies in ways that build counterpower from below and socialist political forces. As Rosa Luxemburg put it, the goal is social revolution. Class struggle for reforms is the means to that end. But there is disagreement among eco-socialists and other supporters of climate justice about what kinds of climate justice reforms we should be pushing for. To maybe pose it starkly, you can think of two positions. One which argues for a rapid transition to renewable energy, phasing out fossil fuels and other sources of greenhouse gas emissions, and, importantly, significantly reducing energy demand in the advanced capitalist countries, which would mean all sorts of important changes in how most people in places like the Canadian state and the US live. All this with the goal of assisting people in imperialized countries, the so-called global south, to be able to use more energy to improve living standards during their transitions away from fossil fuels. And on the other hand, you have a camp that argues for, yes, a rapid transition to renewable energy, and yes, slashing greenhouse gas emissions, but which doesn't raise the question of lowering energy demand in the imperialist countries. And I think this disagreement is associated with different stances to degrowth politics and also to nuclear power. So to start off on this, I pose this as a stark choice between two approaches. Which of those two approaches would you say you support and why in terms of this debate among climate justice supporters?
Okay, I'll kick off here. So the forces of revolutionary socialism are incredibly tiny in the world today and haven't really carved out a specific program of eco-socialism that has caught on amongst wider masses. On the left, for me, the two most interesting programs are those that you've just named, the degrowth camp and the those calling for a kind of radical Green New Deal. I'm thinking of people like Kate Aronoff and Thea Riofrancos and Naomi Klein and others. The degrowthers are individuals like Jason Hickel and Yurios Kalis and so on. And broadly speaking, the degrowthers are advocating a kind of utopian socialism / anarchism, a revolution of consciousness, a grassroots revolution that begins to affect a kind of anti-capitalist transition through building alternative communities, non-capitalist communities in your locality. The Green New Deal camp is more focused on bringing about a state engineered green transformation of national economies and ultimately of the global economy. And I mean, at face value, you can see these two camps as antithetical. But in the article that you mentioned at the top of the program, at the top of the podcast, I argue that each of these camps covers a very, very broad terrain. And on the far left of each of them, I think they have a great deal in common. And I think it's on the left that you find a kind of anti-capitalist node among the Green New Dealers and among the degrowthers. And in terms of practical politics, there's a great deal that they can and must unite around. Support for home insulation programs, which on the one hand is an investment program that states need to back, which would create many jobs, reduce inequality, ticking all the Green New Deal boxes, but also it's reducing consumption of fossil gas, fossil fuels, which is the overriding concern of degrowthers, reducing the material footprint of capitalist society on this planet. So this is what I would argue in respect of those two broad camps, that left should aspire to hegemony within them and creating a sort of coalescence of them at the anti-capitalist corner.
I would say here, trying to complement this conversation, that the Green New Deal, or whatever name it takes, depending on the place, because it really depends on historical context, the political makeup of a movement. But let's say the Green New Deal is here a particular project that involves certain investments, involves certain guarantees, certain rights, and a general orientation towards transition, primarily energy transition, which has been one of the major focus, and in the sense of either in terms of energy infrastructure or looking, for example, into energy efficiency, as was the example around insulation that Gareth just gave us. The GND here is a particular instrument that we have. Degrowth is more of an orientation. So you can have a GND that's more oriented towards green capitalism, that it's about just pumping money into these like private companies around solar and wind and things like that. Or it could be a GND that uses the state machine in order to strengthen communities that have been left aside for a really long time, or promoting a little bit of energy democracy, bringing urban reform into the conversation. So the orientation matters here in terms of who's going to be promoting the GND. So I would say that, yes, they're not completely separate camps, and there are people doing work trying to talk and promote some sort of dialogue around this. So degrowth as an orientation around the GND would come along in terms of understanding that you might have like a combination around growth and degrowth depending on the sectors here, but how is this connecting to this larger objective that Gareth mentioned, that is the reducing this material footprint. So this means a game of give and take, and this conversation around the reforms is very good here. And like you mentioned, David, you mentioned Rosa Luxemburg, and we could bring in Andre Gortz as well, talking about non-reformist reforms and this capacity in terms of reforms that will give us enough of a structural shape that can help us with movement building, because it can help to address the needs of the working class right now, but also in terms of raising class consciousness that we need to organize if we want to change things and if we want to achieve certain goals. But it also means that they are only going to be non-reformists in the sense that we make sure they are non-reformists, that we don't stop there, that we keep building the movement towards something bigger, understanding that we won't be able to overcome capitalism through capitalist means. We can only go so far. But with the ecological crisis and a little bit closer to us talking particularly about the climate crisis, that we are already seeing very hardcore impacts of the climate crisis right now, it means that we have issues around time here, right? So it would be great if we could just change everything right now this year, 2022, and then we could fix the crisis a lot quicker if we have eco-socialism. But to have eco-socialism, we need to build the conditions for it. So what we're trying to do here is work on this combination of approaches that will help us buy time in terms of building more revolutionary prospects that can go at the core, like at the pillars of capitalism, and at the same time, improve people's lives and reduce this material footprint, get us some ecological gain as well. So it is a combination of approaches. So we would have, for example, the GND here as an instrument. Degrowth can be a part of the orientation. And I would say there are other orientations here. So if we talk about Buen Vivir and these concepts around the good life, this is an orientation that I say could be combined with degrowth. There are a lot of Latin American scholars and movement leaders that have been talking, for example, how can we get degrowth, post-extractivism, and Buen Vivir into a conversation here? Like, where can we actually temper each other and create a more holistic approach? And eco-socialism here, of course, as a horizon, so we don't fall into traps of green capitalism or traps around, believing that if we just improve energy technology, this is going to be enough. So this requires us to be very alert about what we do, so we don't end up just giving in to these projects that are good in the sense that they're very palpable, like you can sense them. The good thing that I find about the Green New Deal is that this is something that you can show people, right? You can show that, this is being done. And when you show people that things are being done, you're actually making a counterpoint to the fact that capitalism is doing things all the time. And usually people think that only capitalism is doing things. So we can use these instruments in our favor, but we have to be quite alert that in terms of the hegemonic stance, we are a minority, well, like Gareth said, right? So the tendency is that once these conversations are out there and these instruments become more mainstream, that green capitalists will take over the process. And this is very much part of the problem we're facing today, because I thoroughly believe that even though part of our job is to fight climate denialism, for example, Trump-style climate denialism, we're actually fighting a different battle right now, which is that, most people recognize there is a climate crisis. The big capitalists know there is a climate crisis, but they want to do it their way. And we need to ensure that we divert all of our energy, both political energy and material energy, in a way that's going to be oriented towards eco-socialism, so we can actually address the crisis once and for all in our horizon.
Now, most of the people listening to this podcast will be in Canada or the US, and so people probably, they're more familiar with the idea of a Green New Deal than they are with degrowth as a whole. So before we talk a little bit about eco-socialism and degrowth, would one of you like to say anything more to explain to listeners about degrowth as a current? And Gareth talked about it a little bit, but because I think it often gets misrepresented by socialists and other people on the left writing about degrowth, maybe Sabrina, would you like to just say a little bit more about just helping people understand degrowth as a political current?
The interesting thing about degrowth is that I do think there is a lot of disagreement within the degrowth camp that usually doesn't get addressed by the critics, right? So people would come and they would critique degrowth as one particular stance, but we have held debates within the eco-socialist camp talking about degrowth, and I've heard a series of perspectives. So there are people who are very concerned with the war. There are people who are very concerned with the notion of economic growth itself, and others who are more focused on material growth and different notions around abundance. So it's very plural. And I think this is a positive thing, because when these debates are plural, it means that we have a lot of room to work through them. And something that I have come across both in my work and my political activism is that in the Global South, this is also a matter of concern, because the degrowth conversations, in the way that they're put out today, they began more in the Global North. Sometimes there is a whole strand that's a lot more academic than connected to movements. But this is something that the degrowth camp is quite aware of. So a lot of the criticisms that are valid usually make their way into the camp. And there's an effort towards synthesis. So this article that they mentioned earlier that was co-authored with three other incredible militants and scholars is based on this idea that if we're going to be talking about eco-socialist degrowth, what are the principles here? What are the matters in terms of giving and taking? And I think the biggest thing that we usually end up having to address because of the mischaracterizations, the misrepresentation of the growth that is out there, is that this idea that the growth is about austerity, and it is not about austerity. The capitalist camp is about austerity. It is about actually reducing not only the role of the state, but the role of the economy in tending to people's needs and tending also to people's wants. And I believe that the degrowth camp, when it's more oriented in a sense around the eco-socialist discussions and the discussions around the good life and the way we've been handling this in Latin America, is actually about enriching people's lives. So making sure that people have the basic needs. And this involves infrastructure, and this involves rearranging of societies. So, for example, cities are built in a different way than they're built today, because today they're built in a way that's not efficient, and they're built in a way that actually makes people waste a lot of time and waste a lot of their own personal energy going about their lives. And this opens up room for us to discuss abundance in a different way. So I would say that degrowth in a way requires us to think about these material limits that are very real, that we have to deal with, because capitalism ignores them every day. And this is part of the problem we're facing today. But also, on the other hand, it's a way for us to reconceptualize what we mean about abundance, what we mean about a good life. But I think there's still a lot of room for us to work in terms of bringing other conversations, other perspectives. So this becomes more, so that this makes more sense to people in the left, both the people who are very knowledgeable about socialism already, but also people who are part of the working class. And ultimately, what they want is to live well. But what it means today in the socialist camp shouldn't be just about copying the capitalist version of living well and putting renewables on it. It means that we need to acknowledge the periphery of the system. We need to acknowledge matters around just transition, solidarity, like Gareth mentioned earlier on. And this will ultimately deal with redistribution, both at the source, when we're dealing with transforming nature into particular resources, but also how we do with this. What do we create more time by reducing the work week as well? And then what do we do with this time? How can we invest more in culture and sports and leisure and all of these other things that are robbed from us all the time by the capitalist system that could be, a source of different types of growth that are also low carbon and put less pressure on Earth. I was supposed to summarize it. I went for a really long time, but I hope you get the gist.
Yeah, I'd just jump in there and just add to this. I mean, I completely agree with the way Sabrina has summarized degrowth. Degrowth is a movement initially based around intellectuals, so quite an academic movement at first, but it's broadened out, and it relates, I think increasingly it's relating to a broader mood, gathering together all these different skeins of growth skepticism that have existed for many decades, both from environmentalists and socialists, and more broadly, people who look at the mantra of economic growth and ask themselves, are we working people really benefiting from this growth? Who is benefiting? There are all sorts of critiques of the economic growth paradigm that the degrowth movement is relating to and kind of coalescing together under this label of degrowth. And I think you're right, David, to say that it's more of a movement in Europe than in North America, but that broader reaction against the failure of economic growth to really improve lives, I think is quite widespread in North America as well. And so, there's a broader mood around growth skepticism that with degrowth as a kind of political, intellectual pole within that terrain. And Sabrina mentioned Kohei Saito's book. Saito is one of the Marxists who's developing interesting ideas on degrowth. Degrowth essentially has a class struggle angle, which the Marxists involved with the degrowth movement are obviously foregrounding, because who is benefiting from growth? It's the rich who is overwhelmingly using the world's abusing the world's resources and creating the climate emergency and all sorts of other forms of environmental despoliation. It's the rich. And so a consequential Marxist reading of degrowth would be to read it as a class struggle movement. But then we need to get on to the question of wants and needs, which Sabrina has been talking about. And David, I think you mentioned in one of your questions. And degrowth, exactly as Sabrina says, is a movement that is not about austerity. It's about it's creating the conditions for a good life for everyone. But what I value in the work of the degrowthers as well is that they bring to discussion of environment and human wants and needs a very sober realism, which tends to be lacking elsewhere. That is to say, they look at, what if we keep on expanding our resource use and energy use at this rate, what is going to happen? In general discourse on these questions, this tends to be ignored. This assumption just is we can keep on creating more and more energy without suffering the consequences. The degrowthers are not the utopians on this count. They are the realists. It's the green growthers who are the utopians, who imagine that capitalism can just continue growing and continue producing more and more and more. And there'll be a sort of law of efficiency and a decoupling process whereby we can all become richer and richer and richer, and our wants can expand and expand and expand in the Promethean style without suffering the consequences. And the degrowthers, I think, bring a really, really useful correction and realist understanding of those questions.
Yeah, we could say it's taking the planetary boundaries concept seriously, right? Taking ecological limits seriously in a very materialist way.
But in a sense, there's even more than that, because usually degrowthers are accused of, not taking technology seriously or like being unscientific in terms of technological development. But one of the things that I find actually refreshing is that it's about dealing with the technology that we have available today, rather than blowing up out of proportion the possible impacts of technology that might be developed in the future, or there's currently under development, but it hasn't been properly tested yet, or may have very complicated consequences, both in terms of like an ethical standpoint, or in the sense of may just actually create a butterfly effect that might make things worse in other areas, right? So this type of techno fixes is something that we have to be quite aware of, in the sense of, what is the process behind creating the technology, who's behind that, what can you do with that, and how much of it can be applied in a large scale without making things go absolutely haywire. And this is different from being anti-technology. So usually I've seen many times the growthers and even ecosocialists get accused of being, Luddites because, you guys just hate technology so much and you're writing this on your phone, aren't you? So what a hypocrite. And it's absolutely bizarre to hear an argument like that coming from a Marxist using that kind of strawman argument that, very low level capitalists use when they're talking about socialists being hypocrites and living under capitalism or something like that. The matter of fact is that this is not about being pro or anti-technology. It's about considering good technology that can be properly applied, that helps with efficiency, that does help to reduce our material footprint, that can be inserted in a system that's under democratic control, that really helps people's lives. And I would say that like a perfect example we find when we're talking about transportation, right? So I think the technology behind electric vehicles is quite important. And I want to have that used towards public transportation, expanding access to public transportation, having more bus routes. I want to have an expanded rail system, but I also want to make sure that when I expand my rail system, I'm considering local communities and what the impact of a high-speed train has in their communities in terms of safety, in terms of noise pollution and the biodiversity in the area. So how can I create tunnels that won't also create other types of negative impacts like a sinkhole due to the structural impacts of the construction. So it means that when we're dealing with technology, and I'm here in my I'm considering the growthers and ecosocialists in their approach to this, is that we're understanding life as a complex system and understanding nature as a very, very complex system that sometimes when you're trying to fix one thing, you might break something else. And we have the capacity, the scientific capacity to foresee this. We might break this other thing. So how about we do this in a different way? What can we allocate differently here? So maybe if we actually reduce a little bit of demand in this one area and create possibilities of a good life that will still make people happy without, even though they might not have access to all of these cars anymore, then I may not have to, go about a way that's going to disrupt this biome here in this area, or, take away the water resources in a desert area in Chile, because I need more and more lithium, right? So what we're talking about when we're talking about technology is a very scientific approach that considers supply chains. And I think Thea Franquist has done a great job. She was already mentioned, but her job talking about the global supply chains around lithium, I think it's quite excellent. And there's many other people doing great work on this. And this is a good thing. It's a good thing that we're aware of our impacts and that when we want to produce taking that into account, because our problem is not just carbon. Our problem is not just greenhouse gases. The climate crisis is one part of a larger ecological crisis, and we need to take all of that into account in the system of inequalities that we're already living in.
Yeah, the point you were making just now, Sabrina, about 20 seconds ago about technology calls to mind for me as well the argument that is made by someone like Julian Allwood. Now, I find he's right. He's a Cambridge University engineer. He is not an anarchist. He is not a socialist. He's not a degrowther, but he is a scientist, and there's something in the basic arithmetic of economics and ecology that is pushing people who are alert to what's going on towards some of the arguments that that Sabrina was making just now about technology. So this guy, he's an engineer and he's not a degrowther, but he is very critical of the arguments that breakthrough technologies, as he refers to them, need to be relied on to get us out of this mess. This sort of technology fetishism that that hopes and prays for the boffins in white coats to come and save us. It's almost a religious, a strange pseudo-scientific religious belief. They will save us with their amazing new technologies. But he points out, Allwood and his group, it's called FIRES, F-I-R-E-S, their research group at Cambridge, they point out that, scaling up technologies takes decades, and we need to radically reduce carbon dioxide and methane emissions within the next 10, 20 years. And they've, in their group, they've developed this program based on the legislation in Britain that holds that Britain must reach so-called net zero by 2050. And they've done the sums and worked out, if Britain is going to do that, then by 2030, all airports, apart from Heathrow and Glasgow, need to be shut down, and all airports in Britain need to be shut down by 2050. But here's the thing, he's not a degrowther. He envisages sometime after that, perhaps there'll be genuinely sustainable aviation coming on stream, and maybe the airports could be reopened after that. He's not philosophically a degrowther in any sense at all, but he recognizes that if that the scale and intensity of the crisis that we face environmentally requires, certainly in the short term, in the next couple of decades, a massive reduction in energy use, and that will require some pretty tricky choices, including for the needs and wants of working people. I mean, certainly the rich need to be cut down to the average consumption, and that will save an awful lot of emissions from being pumped up into the atmosphere. But working people who, if they are addicted to eating beef and driving SUVs and flying all over the place, well, so, you seriously, if you have to ask, is the planet going to remain a habitable place, or is your lifestyle going to have to change?
Can I just interject here? Yeah, this is a point around political education. And I think it's something that's usually missed out of the conversation, right? Like people are like, oh no, the working class has this one perspective, how they want to live. They've learned that if you have a lot of low-cost airlines, you can go everywhere and you could post that on Instagram. How dare us take that away from them? We can't do that. We're not going to be able to include the working class in the climate movement if you tell them they can't take low-cost airlines and fly everywhere all the time. I find that to be an approach that's absolutely counterproductive. First of all, because it doesn't consider that the majority of the working class is not taking low-cost airlines all the time, right? We're talking about, every now and then, obviously, low-cost airlines made planes more accessible to people with low incomes, but this is not what's happening all the time. Tourism is a political construction. The way that it's built today is part of this political construction. Migration is a matter that concerns us very much. Like, I'm a migrant myself, so obviously I would like to keep traveling, but the amount of travel I do also needs to come into consideration around socially necessary travel. And socially necessary travel is not just me going to visit my parents. It should include tourism and leisure as well. But this should be part of a conversation around our modes of transportation, around how we're investing in certain technologies. So like if we're going to be talking about liquid to fuel technology for airplanes to be able to fly in other places, well, there's no point in just talking about liquid to fuel if we're not considering the global supply chain around these technologies, what it means in terms of the resources being employed, and what are the other alternatives as well. And sometimes it might take longer for you to get somewhere, but you still get there. But how can you tell people that they're going to have to take longer when capitalism promises everything so much faster? Well, we need to slow down the pace of life. And maybe if we reduce the work week, we have more of an opportunity to slow down the pace of life. So we need to consider that this is not about taking one action. We have to coordinate. We need to take a lot of different actions at the same time and see how they complement each other, how they help to solve some of these contradictions. And sometimes when we're talking about tech, we're talking about old tech. I know it's not cool. It's not, it's not shiny. It's not... modern enough for a lot of people. But when I think Gareth mentioned meat, and I think that has been part of some of the recent controversies in the field. But a lot of people are more willing to consider lab meat something that's super expensive today, that is still is energy intensive, because the production of lab meat is still going to be energy intensive. So, yes, we're not talking about methane anymore, but it's still energy intensive. If from the standpoint of animal liberation, it still involves a certain level of animal exploitation. And it's not bold enough if we're talking about food sovereignty, because if we were actually working from a paradigm of food sovereignty, we could be considering, biodiversity through agroecological techniques that have been taught for a really long time and excluded from our mainstream way of looking to agriculture, because we have it's so terrible to think this, but even the socialist camp has been absolutely colonized by the Green Revolution way of thinking about agriculture. So the way that, Bill Gates does things, the way Monsanto does things, the way agro does things, a lot of people in the socialist camp still think that, well, that's the only way for us to have a farm. That's the only way for us to, grow grains and raise livestock and other things like that. And we absolutely need to get out of that mindset and think of how we can actually, promote agroecological systems that will be solar powered, but they need to be solar powered in a way that's decentralized, in a way that helps, small cooperatives to coordinate along with democratic planning, the level of stocks for certain grains, because that's going to help to regulate the prices for food as well. So you can have those regulating stocks in place, and at the same time grow other things that we don't get to grow because they're not seen as commercially viable for the big supermarket chains. So if we think from a standpoint of food sovereignty and see democracy, for me, that's the best technology that we can have in terms of our techniques and integration with, the shiny tech, rather than thinking of lab meat. And I think that makes even creates a more viable path for those working with animal liberation and veganism to make sense to people, because it won't be just, you're reducing your meat intake. No, we're actually bringing a lot more other types of food into your plate, and you're eating better and things like that. It's a more productive standpoint here.
Can I just respond to something, a couple of things that Sabrina has been saying just now? I mean, the first one is when you were talking, Sabrina, about about aviation having to be rationed, or even in some senses banned, reduced, curtailed. You mentioned, I think, the need to join, that the issues need to be joined together, and this is exactly where socialist arguments come to the fore, come into their own, because rather than simply saying to people, the future we're arguing for is one in which you cannot fly or can only fly once a year. Instead of leaving it at that, you're saying, no, we are arguing for high-speed rail to be developed from where I live in London down to Spain. So you can get overnight trains cruising just at 120 miles an hour. You can get an overnight train and be somewhere very sunny and by the beach in time for breakfast. You can put concrete proposals, and more importantly, and in a more revolutionary sense, you link it to arguments around who controls work time. Sabrina mentioned the intense pace of capitalist accumulation, and it's a pace that imposes itself, hammers itself into our lives at every minute of the day, and we need to smash that control of our time by a capitalist metronome, and argue for its replacement with a much more fluid and relaxed form of living, which would enable us to, instead of feeling that we have to get a holiday and jump on a flight and have a few days somewhere nice and warm and jump back onto the plane to get home in time to clock on at work again, we could, take a boat somewhere for a couple of weeks and spend a couple of months somewhere and then return. A more leisurely pace is part of the argument that I think that conjoins socialist call for workers' power with an environmental logic. On lab meat, I'm a bit of an agnostic, I have to admit, on lab meat. I'm not sure. I certainly take Sabrina's point that it's at the moment seems to be very energy intensive in its production, but I am persuaded by those who argue that shortly after fossil fuels, the greatest ecological crime that we have been committing is towards our grandchildren and great-grandchildren is meat consumption, because what is it? Something like half of the world is half of the land in the world is devoted, or 84% of agricultural land is devoted to livestock production, from which we get 15% of our protein or something derisory. It's incredibly inefficient. I'm not sure how whether capitalism is dependent on meat, the meat industry. I mean, there's been a lot of debate on whether capitalism is dependent on fossil fuels, and you can argue, it's not really, because capitalism began to rise before fossil fuels were being used in a big way, but then industrial capitalism really only depended on the highly concentrated and continually usable forms of energy that fossil fuels enabled for its great expansion in the 19th century and its globalization and so on. But what about cattle agriculture? Is that something completely necessary to capitalism? I mean, the word capital, of course, comes from cattle, so they're joined at the hip etymologically, but I'm not sure whether they are, whether the capitalist system relies on that. And so, so the whole argument for lab meat, I think, is one that I'm agnostic on. George Monbiot, in his new book, Regenesis, he develops quite an interesting thesis on technology. He argues that just as the pill was a new technology which synergized with the women's movement, with feminist movements in the 60s and 70s to begin to completely transform the lives of women and the way women are perceived in a sexist society and so on. So too, the technology of lab meat, he thinks, could catalyze a worldwide anti-meat movement where people look aghast at the way in which the world has been parceled up among the cattle ranchers to the detriment of wildlife, which have been completely pushed aside to the margins and and with enormous methane release and etc. Which is an interesting little thesis, I think.
The things that I don't think we actually need lab meat to bring that level of consciousness for people to be really shocked about what happens in terms of animal exploitation at those levels. And what's interesting is that a lot of these, plant-based alternatives to meat that taste like meat, and people have been, the ultra-processed kind, we'll get into other problems around that in terms of being ultra-processed. They are very much based on peas and soy and chickpeas and other levels of vegetable protein. But to answer to that point on capitalism and the level of production, like, for example, if everyone stopped eating meat today, Brazilian economy would collapse. And the Brazilian economy would collapse, not just because Brazil exports a lot of meat, but because Brazil exports a lot of commodities tied to industrial livestock in other parts of the world. So, for example, the majority of the soy that Brazil exports is towards raising livestock, China, in other parts of the world, right? So this is something that absolutely needs to be addressed. And I would say that if we put this just in the sense of, the way that meat is consumed today and produced today, and lab meat on the other side, maybe we're missing a beautiful variety of things, the line between when we're talking about agroecology and plant-based alternatives that actually, connect us more to the land, that put other things on our plate. And I think this is one of the things that get into that conversation around values and good life and what's growing and what's degrowing. But anyway, we don't want to completely hijack the conversation on this as well, David.
No, this is great. I think that you both raised some really important questions that eco-socialists and other people who are seriously grappling with these things need to be thinking about. But I do want to maybe take a few minutes to talk about people on the left who disagree with the line of discussion that we've been pursuing, because there certainly are, articulate people who are part of, in the US, DSA, for example, who would disagree with a lot of it. Not long ago, a Canadian union researcher named Adam King wrote an article in the publication Passage against degrowth, and he was referring in that article to Matt Huber, who's a US socialist, who's recently published a book called Climate Change as Class War. He's picking up on Huber's point that a class-based strategy that raises the material well-being of the working class is needed to win a just transition in the first place. With this argument that in order to win support in the working class, the key is to raise the material well-being of the working class. And then going on from that to disparage degrowth and saying that that means trying to convince workers in the West that they have to undergo extreme austerity and immiseration. That means you can't win working class support. You've already referred to the fact that it's kind of a straw dog argument because people, eco-socialist degrowth supporters, are not talking about extreme austerity. But could you maybe just focus in on this kind of argument that you get from some people who would identify as eco-socialists, right? But who would argue that the solution would include not only a rejection of anything that smacks of degrowth, but much more of an emphasis on technology, nuclear power, for example, as part of the transformative vision that they would be arguing for as an alternative to ecological crisis.
There is one thing that Matt Huber says, that I agree with him in terms of his reading of the environmental movement in North America in particular. There is a distance. There is a distance between, more professional environmentalists and some NGOs and the academics who work on this, and part of the industrial working class. That is a matter that has to be addressed. It requires more hands-on efforts in terms of not just, just saying that we're going to transition your jobs. Don't worry, we're going to transition your jobs, but understanding the peculiarities involved into this and, how the unions work, and in the sense that people sometimes may be even emotionally attached to the jobs that they do today, and they may be afraid of change. And I think this is absolutely normal. For people to be afraid of change. But I think this is where political education should be playing a big role, right? So when we have unions in other parts of the world, and we have them both in the global north and in the global south doing work saying that we're going to transition your jobs, let's talk about what that means. Let's talk about the realities and how can we make this other job better. A few months ago, I think it was back in June, I was in a debate in Germany, in Berlin, on transition and what in Germany they've been calling the Green New Deal something like socio-ecological transformation. And it was a debate on that. And there were in the audience workers from the auto and the metal unions. In fact, later we started having a conversation about the metal workers union in Brazil. That's very traditional and connected to other parts of the world. But I ended up saying something that I thought, wow, they might take this very harshly, but I think I'm going to say it anyway, which was the fact that many times the left is telling these people that they're going to transition their jobs when they're actually talking about conversion, and conversion is not going to be enough. So this idea that you're a worker in the auto industry, we're just going to convert your job to a job in the auto industry, but now it's going to be green. Now it's going to be around renewables and electric cars and things like that. So don't worry, it's not going to be that hard. We're going to convert your jobs. When in fact, the conversation around transition involves even abolishing some jobs, right? So there are areas where we're going to be reducing it so much, but we need to be doing this in a way where these jobs become obsolete. So it's not a matter of let's fire these people and closing down these industries. No, let's change the structure. The infrastructure is a better name here. Let's change the infrastructure around job creation here with other industries, with other needs, so that those other jobs, they don't make any sense anymore. I want a job in the coal mining industry to become obsolete because we don't need coal anymore, because we have advanced enough in our energy transition that these jobs won't make sense. So yes, those people, unfortunately, even if some of them might be attached, I have a hard time believing this is the rule. Working with, mining communities in the global south, we know how people are usually attached to their jobs because this is how they make a living, and because their local communities, if you take away, if you close down that mine, the community is going to lose most of their economic infrastructure, right? So they're attached in that sense, but most people are not attached, to, going down into the earth, for a real long time and, not seeing the light of day. So we can work in terms of political education to make sure that these new jobs are also better jobs, that they are desirable, and that life is not just about working anymore. So I think this is one of the beauties of bringing the degrowth into the conversation, that we understand that most of the time we've been talking about transition as a way of moving from an alienating job to another alienating job, but now it's a green alienating job. We don't want these alienating jobs anymore. We want the jobs to make sense, for people to be proud of what they're doing. And sometimes that involves, many different things. So recently I've been reading things about wind power plants in Spain, and in terms of dealing with the biodiversity, biodiversity in the area, because we know that wind turbines may pose a risk to certain birds and wildlife in the area. You actually have bird watchers employed, so they can take notes of when birds are going through the area, so they can contact the unit that's responsible for those turbines, so they can stop those turbines for so many hours to let those birds go through, and then they start again. So look, I have never heard of that before, and I've been dealing with wind power for a really long time, because sometimes there are different things that are marginal and we don't pay attention to them because we're just focused on the traditional jobs. So I do think Matt has a point in terms of making sure that we understand that the class war is against the capitalists, it's not between workers. But I also don't think it's in our detriment to make sure that workers understand that there are other workers in other parts of the world who are going through a really hard time, and their jobs are even more precarious than yours. So making these adjustments around production and consumption in all other parts is going to be good for other people too. So sometimes a little bit of a loss here is not about immiseration and extreme austerity. Is it about an adjustment and class solidarity? Internationalist class solidarity. And I think this is something that should actually be helping us organize and get people excited about, I'm not a worker just in my city, in my country. I'm part of a community. And isn't this one of the core principles of Marxism?
If I could just bounce off a few points that Sabrina has just made. The first one is really an incidental point, an aside, which is it's nice to hear a Marxist defending the interests of the bird life of Spain in the face of wind turbines. I've just been reading this wonderful book by Troy Tese and someone Prendergast.
Ecosocialism, right?
That's right, Ecosocialism. And it's generally an absolutely wonderful book, but there's this little section where they have a pop at Marxists, a dig at Marxists for being anti-bird, with the noble exception of Rosa Luxemburg. But on another book, which is a wonderful read, on wind turbines in Spain, is David Hughes' book. It's just a gorgeous book, and it's gorgeous partly because he recognizes that if we're going to see an effective transition to an ecological socialist society, then you need to start with the people who are going to make the new world, the ordinary people. And he looks at he's an anthropologist who's done an ethnography of people whose lives have been affected by wind turbines.
This is where I learned about the bird watchers, by the way.
Right,
This book, Who Owns the Way? Yeah.
In that book, it's a wonderful, wonderful book. And reading that book again reaffirms in me the sense that if an eco-socialist program is to reach out to workers en masse, you have to have something to say, and this is what Sabrina's been talking about on the question of job security, and so climate jobs programs that of the sort that I've been involved in here in Britain in the past and have been developed elsewhere in the world, I think need to be front and center of movement activity for eco-socialists as well. And if you're a Green New Dealer or a degrowther, you can. There's nothing about a climate jobs program that you can't get involved with. It's crucial because one of the great problems that we face on the question of material well-being that you, David, were raising through the Matt Huber argument is that if people are fearful for their jobs and they fear that environmental transition will cut that basic support for their livelihoods will be just robbed from them, then that's the surefire way to get them to engender opposition. So job security, it seems to me, is absolutely fundamental. But I think we have to gamble on the fact that that most people can lead very, very happy lives if they have reasonably comfortable and secure livelihoods. People aren't driven to constantly acquire more, I don't believe. So when Matt Huber in the quote that you read from talks of material well-being, I think we can say, yes, basic material needs being met and a reasonable quality of life being met is important, but not endless expansion of our needs. And then when we look at a country like the United States of America, it becomes quite tricky because in the United States, energy use per capita is double that in Europe. It's double that in Britain, for example. The average quality of life in Britain is perfectly reasonable. But the United States, it's indefensible, I think, to argue that the scale of energy use that we see in the United States can be retained, because then you're arguing, if you're a socialist, therefore an internationalist, you're arguing that everyone around the world has to have this level of energy use. And if you do the sums, you quickly realize that we would have to carpet the entire world with wind turbines and nuclear power stations, tens of thousands of them, to produce the sort of energy that program would require. And so this is why I keep on coming back to the fact that the basic arithmetic dictates that in the rich world there has to be a reduction in energy use. And I fear that the Jacobin types, Jacobin is a broad church. You, I think, David, were mentioning Huber's argument. That sort of perspective needs to look at those numbers with a little more care, I think.
Yeah, and I think, as you've both already said in very articulate ways, it's a question about, digging deeper into what we understand by working class well-being, right? It's talking about a quality of life and, delinking that from certain, forms of consumption that in countries like the US and Canada, where it's come to be associated with. So it's a question, I think, of digging deeper and talking about, yes, improving people's quality of life, but that also means changing how people live within the imperialist countries in important ways. Also, I think it's worth pointing out in this context that, given where capitalism is going, the way people have been living in the, better off working class people in countries like the US and Canada they're not going to be still offered the same kinds of things that they've been offered as capital's attack on working class living standards intensifies. So that also needs to be brought into the discussion. But there's another argument that comes from people in that particular quarter of the left that we've been engaging with, which argues that, you're talking about the need to win all sorts of reforms. You're talking about the Green New Deal, all sorts of investment, but also the expansion of various kinds of social protection, for example, if we're going to get job security for people and so on. And winning those kinds of reforms under capitalism, they might argue, looking to the history of capitalism, can't happen unless there's economic growth. So the argument gets made then from a certain sector of the left that, if you're trying to win these changes under capitalism, it's not possible unless you also have capitalist economic expansion. Would either of you like to respond directly to that argument?
Yeah, I'd respond by plugging an article that has just appeared online and is freely available and addresses precisely this point. It's by Jack Copley, and it's called Decarbonizing the Downturn, Addressing Climate Change in an Age of Stagnation. And he's putting his finger on exactly this problem, which is, profit rates are declining, economic growth per capita is in decline, and so we're not and debt levels have been rising year by year, decade by decade. So there's more and more that we're imposing on the future to bail us out, so to speak. And so the constraints on states are just growing more and more severe. There's less and less easy money around to fund a transition. And so that is why at the end of the day we have to get back to questions of redistribution and anti-capitalism and class struggle that we have to mobilize from below to force states to act. Economies are ultimately just arrangements of human beings undertaking labor. So it's a political question how that labor is arranged. And the transition, an ecologically effective and socially just transition could quite feasibly be achieved, but it requires enormous pressure from below. I can't see, partly for the reasons that Jack Copley discusses in the piece I mentioned, I find it hard to see states simply out of a recognition of their own interests in establishing a general framework for successful capital accumulation in the long term. I can't foresee governments implementing the scale of changes that are required to keep the planet more or less habitable.
And this is also like coming from the standpoint that we're going to need a lot of pressure. It also has to be very international pressure, right? Because there are in places where you find governments that might be willing to take a step further, they might be vulnerable in other ways, because their economies are dependent in other places, or because there are, imperialist interventions where they are. So that the level of international support, coordination, talking in terms of, creating international campaigns, agreements, social movements, sharing best practices on how to apply this pressure, I think is quite important here. This is what helps to draw the line between, especially if we're talking about a Green New Deal approach, perspectives that will bring in a lot of state investment, but they will be done through public institutions towards public goods, creating good jobs that will help and, to build healthier economies and healthier communities. And this idea of the Green New Deal is just an investment package that a lot of the green capitalist companies can benefit from, or as we've been seeing lately, even fossil capital gets to benefit from it. If you just throw at them, they can use like carbon capture technologies or other things like that, and take a piece of the process, or what's happening with the European Union painting fossil gas and nuclear power as green in a way that helps to divert investment from what should be going towards all, renewables into those areas, because, well, now it's green. Now you can meet your targets in terms of, the financial companies and the states in terms of how much money they put in green energy, right?
Perhaps we should also directly take on, just briefly, it could be a whole episode on its own, but the question of nuclear power, because this is something which gets brought up, including by comrades who are very committed to an eco-social transformation of one kind or another, but who argue that in fact it's necessary to have nuclear power as part of the vision for the transition. So what are your thoughts about the question of maintaining or even expanding nuclear power as a source of electricity during the transition away from fossil fuels, which we obviously all agree is desperately needed?
Well, the good news on the nuclear question is that renewable energy now is much, much cheaper than nuclear. So there's no, even in pure capitalist utilitarian terms, there's no need for nuclear power, and forms of storage and smoothing over supply fluctuations from renewables are developing all the time. And a couple of other points I would add, are that nuclear power. The problem of waste of nuclear power has still not been solved. We've had nuclear power stations for the last 80 years or something, and scientists have been trying to develop forms of safe waste disposal, and they haven't. I was struck a few years ago when I was reading about the schemes that are being devised to communicate to future inhabitants of this planet 10,000, 20,000, 100,000 years from now, that the territory that they're approaching is highly radioactive due to human beings however many thousand years prior to them having dumped their waste there. And some semioticians devised this scheme of, perhaps we could genetically engineer rodents or cats so that they glow when they approach these waste areas, nuclear highly irradiated areas, and so future inhabitants of the planet, future Earthlings would be warned. Problem there is that what if I saw a glowing creature, I might start worshipping it and congregate around this area, and then I and my loved ones would all kill from cancer. It's a flippant point in a sense, but it actually attests to something very, very serious, which is that the waste problem hasn't been fixed in any way. And nuclear power plants are potentially going to become more and more dangerous as well. Fukushima was a tsunami. Well, as climate change melts the polar ice, we're going to see an increasing levels of earthquake and volcanic activity as the Earth's crust is bent and creaked out of the shape it had previously been in. So I don't know whether there are going to be any fewer tsunamis happening, possibly more. The rivers in France that cool the nuclear power stations are being are dried up to such an extent that the power stations can't run anymore, and it's causing all sorts of problems. Over in Ukraine, we're seeing what can happen when countries go to war. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Russia's occupation of the enormous nuclear power plant there could lead to infernal damage if it is struck by a missile, etc., etc. So just this year, we're seeing some very powerful new arguments against nuclear power. I don't think it's something that eco-socialists should really entertain.
The thing for me around nuclear power is that, yes, all of the arguments around how technology has evolved around it. So a reactor today is not the same thing as it was 30 years ago. Even the systems of storage are not the same ways as before. But obviously, nuclear power is something that leaves very, very, very long-lasting effects. Right. So technology will develop, but the next generation is always dealing with the older technology and the risks implied by the older technology. Right. So if you're dealing with matters around storage, how much can you actually measure in terms of corrosion? Now, if we're talking about hundreds of years or thousands of years into the future, this is something that's really hard to measure. You can have scientific confidence, but it's where you have a little bit of a margin of error, and the margin of error could lead to something really, really bad, right? We already know that one of the elements when we're discussing the Great Acceleration is how the radiation levels on Earth have increased in the past year. So Great Acceleration is a way for us to think of the ecological crisis beyond the climate crisis. There are many other things involved here, but that said, I'm not a person who's not part of a camp that says shut down all the nuclear plants and everything like that. But what I really think our focus in terms of politics should be here is that nuclear is not a viable option today if we're talking about energy transition because of basic things. Like even if we're not talking about the risks connected to war, like Gareth mentioned, or the risks connected to radiation, it's such slow deployment. is absolutely slow deployment. And nuclear plants have a tendency to go over budget and never meet their deadlines of inauguration, right? So like France is now talking about nationalizing EDF completely, right? And France is very reliable on nuclear power, so much that it's dealing with this huge crisis because of the droughts right now. And the Flamanville plants there, I actually looked at those numbers earlier, and originally it was supposed to cost 3.3 billion euros, and right now probably it's going to cost 12.7 billion euros. So this is the difference from, the planning and the actual cost today, right? And it was supposed to start running in 2012. Now they think the end of 2023, right? So nuclear plants, from a very basic, even if we took away all of this conversation, because they're always accusing us of fear mongering when we talk about the risks. So let's say, even if nuclear was very safe, technology involved to the point of no concerns at all, it's still, if we're talking about the level of energy transition that we need now, actually for yesterday, right? But that we need immediate, nuclear cannot fulfill our immediate needs in terms of, transition and energy deployment around renewables. It can't, right? It takes a really, really long time. And it's also the type of energy that we need to consider when we're talking about our job being not just mitigating climate change, but also adapting to climate change. And I'm going to throw, for example, hydropower in the mix here, because the droughts right now, if we consider Norway and China, countries that have bet on the renewables around hydropower, they're both having problems producing enough electricity out of hydropower this year because of the droughts, right? And Norway is very dependent on hydropower electricity, so they're having issues around that. And China is now saying, because, you have a huge drought affecting the Onze River and the tributaries, they're going to have to focus on coal again, right? So if we don't plan our energy transition away from fossil fuels around adaptation as well, you're actually maybe delaying the transition, because you're creating these loopholes where fossil fuels can just come back in. So right now in Europe, fossil fuels coming back in because of the war on Ukraine, because we need to be burning coal again in Germany because we cannot move fast enough, and we had made this promise about deactivating our nuclear plants, and now we're regretting this, right? There's part of the conversation in the debates around energy in Germany right now. But the reality is this: if we don't do planning that's also around adaptation, we're gonna run into a lot of issues. So if we're dealing with intermittency, so this problem that around renewables, that the sun is not always shining in one particular spot and the wind is not always blowing in a particular spot, we have to have a mix in our energy grid. And we need this mix to be connected, yes, to proper storage. And that relates us to thinking that maybe our strategic minerals should be going to this kind of storage and not a bunch of a billion electric vehicles. This requires a lot of planning. And the issue for me around nuclear power is that usually people who just throw nuclear power in the mix is because they don't want to deal with the complicated questions around planning, or because they want to say that, no, but you're talking about, limits to energy production and electricity. No way. We can have everything shiny and 100 TVs because we have nuclear power. And you're just, throwing the fear mongering at it. So if I come from a place of good faith that there are people, and I think it's important that, we make a lot of scientific advancements in terms of storage, because there's already a lot of nuclear waste. So we need to be dealing with this nuclear waste management and governance, which is another matter, right? Governance is also a global issue. And it's important to develop in that standpoint, but my main problem here is people throwing nuclear in the mix as if it could be the foundation of an energy transition away from fossil fuels. And if we look at the numbers, the concrete reality is that the technology that we have available today and the pace and cost of nuclear today is just not feasible. So we shouldn't paint it green. We shouldn't make it part of our strategy. We should be focusing on renewables that can be easily implemented, that are becoming cheaper, like Gareth mentioned, and we should be focused on doing this in a coordinated way that deals with demand and supply issues, so we don't create more sacrifice zones along the way and make, destroy some ecosystems and create, make communities into completely dispensable communities, just so we can keep the energy levels absolutely high or even higher in other places.
And the point that Sabrina makes about the time that it takes to develop nuclear fission plants, the same point about time applies to nuclear fusion, which a lot of people are increasingly expressing hopes in, because, it would be a relatively clean technology and it would be quite a marvelous energy source if it's ever developed. But there's no possibility of it being developed in the next 10, 20 years, which is the time frame where we really need to see radical change if we're not going to see escalating feedback mechanisms driving runaway warming into a trap from which the Earth would be unrecoverable for human existence, really.
Yeah, again, the point is that sometimes socialists are trying to outsource our job of planning, coordinating, and educating for a transition into technology, and saying that, if a problem still exists because technology hasn't advanced enough. Maybe the problem still exists because we haven't tackled it properly, and we have done that in a collective way and working from like a good faith standpoint here.
Speaking of technological fixes, which capitalism, for understandable reasons, is pushing us towards in all sorts of ways, I think there's another technology which is going to become more politically important given global heating, and that's solar radiation management, in the form of spraying aerosolized particles into the atmosphere to reflect more solar radiation and therefore prevent further heating. Solar radiation management, or SRM. I think we're going to be hearing more about this in the coming years, and it's going to be increasingly important for the left to have a lot of political clarity on how we approach this. How do you think we should approach this this question at this point?
Well, I think I've mentioned before that I think mentioned before in this conversation that I think we really are looking at catastrophic prognoses for this planet on which we live. I don't think it's far-fetched to consider scenarios of civilizational collapse or even extinction of the human species. The study I mentioned of the Caltech study of stratocumulus cloud disappearance if we reach 4 degrees over pre-industrial levels. I mean, these are fat tales that you're talking about. These aren't necessarily the most likely scenarios, but even that they are deemed possible makes you shudder, because that would be a 12 degree in total rise in global temperatures, which would just absolutely obliterate human life and the life of most mammals. Now, one of the most plausible scenarios for an extremely severe temperature rise is the termination shock that would follow the termination of a solar radiation management experiment of the type that you mentioned. And this is, you can read about this in, I think it's Naomi Oreskes' book, first painted this scenario where the world gets hooked on SRM geoengineering, and then something happens that forces it to be switched off. Perhaps a war, geopolitical conflict is very plausible candidate. And so it gets switched off, upon which the rebound would be absolutely astonishing in pace and scale. And so with those sorts of scenarios in mind, it's clear that we should oppose SRM.
There's something really odd to me to think that in our search for solutions to a system that completely through nature out of its equilibrium point, what we're going to do now is make it worse and create an equilibrium point that depends on geopolitics, that depends on a particular type of technology being maintained for a really long time and could create other problems. So it always gets to, the whole Mark Fisher paradigm, right? Like, imagining the end of the world, like, no, we can imagine like really, really, really crazy things, and we can put all of our thoughts and sometimes investment into it, but we can't really imagine, like Fisher said, actually ending capitalism. So sometimes this makes its way into our leftist camp as well. Just, I think it connects a little bit to some level of melancholy, not having enough victories, and low levels of organizing, low levels of mobilization, that let's hope someone else can do this for us, or something like SRM. If we can fix this, SRM is going to save us in the end. Well, the worse that it gets, the more that the more tweaking that you're going to have to do in terms of SRM. So the risks go higher. Also, in terms of like very, very small scale, you can already set like a hydrological cycle in a state of complete disarray. And once you do that, that can affect, how you're growing food. It can lead to terrible monsoons in one area, more droughts in other areas. That in turn is going to affect your nuclear plants, because you won't be able to, cool off the reactors the same way as before. And then some people might say, oh, just kill the river. There's no problem. Just throw the hot water in the already warming river, which is the huge debate in France right now. And then it makes me question people if their goal when they're talking about tackling climate change is actually ecological or not. Because if it's just about maintaining, capitalist society, then yes, you can do all of those things. You can do all of that. You can stretch it along the way so much that you have the billionaires thinking about, capitalism in space. You can just keep stretching forever. But if the perspective at the bottom is ecological, then I think we need to consider other things along the way, and including some boundaries here are what we're messing with and what we're not. I'm not a person to say that you shouldn't, let's just I don't want to censor science in terms of, thinking into things, or kind of developments can be done here, especially because we always know that in terms of scientific development, sometimes you're developing one thing and then you have a discovery that leads into something else that's positive. So I think it's important to study what's going on around it, but whether this gets implemented is something else. And we already know of experiments being made without a proper system of governance, right? And this is not just for SRM. It's just thinking like geoengineering as a system is quite complicated, because where are the ethics behind it? Who's controlling it? You have billionaires pumping, like Bill Gates is the big example of like his investment portfolio. He loves this kind of stuff. But you have these people pumping money into certain technologies that when they get to talk about them being feasible or not, it means that they have been testing some of these things, right? And what it means when they're testing SRM technologies, on the coast of Australia, what it means for the biodiversity in the area, and what this could mean in terms of affecting these hydrological cycles. These are really, really big questions when we're talking about technology here. And my big worry again around the techno fixes that I think they distract us. They distract us from easier things that are ahead, that we can provide, but are harder in the sense of organizing and mobilizing. So they're harder in the sense of movement building. But if we are socialists and eco-socialists, if we have this kind of perspective, movement building is at the core of it anyway, because movement building is not just to save the planet from ecological collapse. It's also to, emancipate the working class. So we should be doing that anyway. And I think this is where eco-socialism, helps us address two problems at once. Our movement building will help us save the earth, and save the earth for an emancipated class of workers, right? So I think that's the big advantage of like this matchmaking here.
Well, you've actually just pointed us, I think, towards the last thing I'm hoping we can talk about before we wrap up, which is really some of the more immediate things that we're confronting in this conjuncture, with a rising cost of living, in a whole number of places, workers demanding higher pay and other forms of relief from that rising cost of living, central banks driving up interest rates in response to the situation. We're facing a recession, which will drive up unemployment. I've just been seeing in the news, Gareth, the news about the estimates about what the costs of home heating are going to be for working class people in Britain in the coming winter. But of course, it's not just going to be there. So in that kind of situation, there are all sorts of politics around the cost of living and the immediate concerns of working class people and mobilizations around those concerns. So I guess the question then for us is, what kind of distinctive contribution do eco-socialists have to make to those kinds of discussions about the immediate situation of working class people as their lives come under these increased stresses and so on?
I think public transportation, I'm going to go back to it because this is one of the things that I like working with because it connects to so many things, right? Germany issued the 9 euro ticket so that people, would be encouraged to take on public transit rather than using individual cars, and that would help to soften this pressure in terms of the energy supply in Germany. But it's not enough for you to make it cheap. You also need to invest into infrastructure. You need to put, more bus routes. You need to educate people around it. And this is one of the things where I think we have a good job of saying, yes, good idea, but we need to go further. And our job dealing, for example, with the issue around the cost of living crisis, and is showing that a really great way of addressing the cost of living crisis, actually reducing the cost of living, is through, transition approaches. And in Brazil, I would say that the inflation right now and the pressure on food prices and how that has impacted food insecurity can only be properly addressed if we're also talking about agrarian reform, if we're also talking about settling indigenous territory. And we're also talking about, bringing the Amazon back into an equilibrium. So we actually have a window, not of opportunity here, but a window of responsibility here to understand the crisis that the working class is facing today as a way of being very strategic about what we're proposing. And this sometimes means educating people through making things cheaper, but we also need to make things more convenient. And what's happening right now is exactly the opposite, right? So the cost of living crisis is being used as a way to, go into, talking about like interest rates as the way of actually managing the costs, rather, for example, having regulating stocks. Or rather than thinking that, wow, the war made us even more vulnerable in terms of our energy supply, let's go back into more terrible fossil fuel rather than, speeding up our energy transition. The opposite is happening. And this is precisely our issue here, because it's reinforcing this idea that there is no alternative. You go back into it. This is something that has made me in particular very frustrated because Brazil, we're coming up with an election right now. We want to get rid of Bolsonaro but getting rid of Bolsonaro doesn't mean that we're going to get rid of the far right, which is a completely different matter. And part of the left and the environmental movement has been pushing for the Lula campaign to be bolder when it comes to transition conversations and, tackling climate change. But then Lula was, when he was answering a question in an interview about the Colombian proposal for phasing out fossil fuels, something that Gustavo Petro and Francia Marquez were talking about during the elections, during the campaign, before they got elected, because they understood that to be something powerful in their campaign. And indeed, it was powerful. It helped to reunite a lot of the demands in the country. Well, Lula was saying, but even Germany is going back on coal and going back on nuclear now. So we can't keep, transition is not a conversation for now. And it's disheartening for me to see that the left sometimes is the one telling itself that we can't do things, And I think our jobs as eco-socialists is to make sure that whenever there's a crisis, there's a bunch of ways of going about it. And the hegemonic way, the mainstream way, is usually the way that reinforces the status quo and takes us back into the past. And our job is to be very, very bold because the crisis is very radical and these crises are not isolated. They're part of how the capitalist system works. The capitalist system is a system of crisis. It is the modus operandi. And our job here is actually to connect these things. And it makes a lot more sense if we're the ones to say that, well, that's enough. And these are the concrete proposals that we have. I have the sense that because the ecological left is marginal in the left that's already been losing for a really long time, we're not far enough as we should be in terms of like being the ones that show that we have the alternative, which is obviously something that the far right has been able to bank on, saying that, well, they're the ones that are actually anti-systemic, right? And we need to reclaim this anti-systemic power, not just in our words, but connecting proposals to the movements themselves.
Yeah, I go along with everything that Sabrina's been saying here, and just add maybe partly with the local context here in Britain. I think for the left to respond to the cost of living crisis involves first of all making clear at every opportunity that this is a crisis that the existing regime has prepared. Banking on fossil fuels has been a disaster, not only for the environment, but for people's wallets now. It's ordinary people are being asked to pay for this crisis. And so the response has to be to nationalize the energy companies, to tax them until they die and shift as much of the funds as you can into renewables, and to find the policy in Britain, especially the land of leaky houses, the land of cold weather and leaky houses, has been to ignore the need to insulate and retrofit homes. And so for the left, this can be a demand for climate jobs spent retrofitting and insulating homes. So addressing questions of job security, decent trade union jobs, to repair and prepare Britain's housing stock for the crises to come, and to wean us off a reliance on fossil fuels. This is why the campaign that I think it was a spin-off from Extinction Rebellion, the campaign called Insulate Britain, was so effective in raising this in public consciousness. And I think this also is for the left. It involves the cost of living crisis. Requires us also to intensify our mobilizations around other issues on which are squeezing the pockets of working class people, above all, rent. So, Britain is a country of very, very high house prices and rent prices, where people spend a third or a half of their income on rent. And so there needs to be a revival of anti-landlord political mobilization and the demand for rent controls. This was something that was aired to some extent here under the brief period of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party, but there are other forces pushing in this direction as well. So question of cost of living is an interesting one in the longer term perspective, whether we are entering an era of basic goods in food and in fuels becoming more and more expensive in a secular sense in the long term, an upward ratchet due to the increasing problems growing food cheaply in a warming world, with all the floods and droughts and so on that we've just been seeing this summer. That's a question that I don't have the expertise to answer, but I know some very interesting people are working on this. And then more broadly, if we step back and look at the era in which we live, it looks to me, and I'm increasingly, as one of intensifying turbulence, both in terms of U.S. hegemonic decline and the rise of China, giving rise to a more geopolitically uncertain and possibly warlike epoch. It's the era of climate change with the polarization around that issue that we're seeing, and so on. So this seems to me to be the broader context in which the left has to situate itself at the moment and in the years to come.
Sabrina and Gareth, I'd like to thank you. You've, I think, given listeners a lot to think about, both in terms of the kind of eco-socialist vision that the situation calls for, but also the more immediate situation that we find ourselves in, and how we might be trying to translate that vision into how we engage with the problems of the here and now. Thanks very much. That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcasts wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.